Meanwhile, at Fighter Strip Number 2, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, a Lockheed P-38G Lightning awaited its mission. The aircraft, powered by twin Allison V1710 8991 engines, could reach speeds of 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Its twin booms extended rearward from the engines, joined by a horizontal stabilizer spanning 52 feet. The central nacelle housed the pilot and weapons system, including 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns and a single Hispano 20mm cannon in the nose, eliminating convergence issues inherent in wing-mounted guns. Every system was optimized for precision, range, and rapid engagement, providing American pilots with a decisive technological edge. This convergence of intelligence, timing, and aviation technology set the stage for what would become one of the most audacious and historically significant fighter interceptions in the Pacific theater. Equipped with two 165-gallon external drop tanks in addition to its 300-gallon internal fuel supply, the Lockheed P-38G Lightning could project power across a combat radius surpassing 450 miles, far beyond any other American fighter in the Pacific theater. Major John William Mitchell, standing in the operations dugout, examined the latest weather reports alongside incoming intelligence. Commanding the 339th Fighter Squadron of the 347th Fighter Group, Mitchell had accumulated over 2,000 hours across a range of aircraft, from basic trainers to cutting-edge fighters. His mind approached the mission like a finely tuned navigation computer, calculating every variable. The direct distance from Guadalcanal to the intercept point was 435 miles, but a straight-line route risked exposure to Japanese radar stations and coastwatcher posts on enemy-held islands. An alternative, longer route swung out to sea before turning north, adding 165 miles. Factoring the return leg, pilots faced roughly 1,000 miles round-trip, leaving only a minimal reserve for approximately 7 minutes of combat at emergency power. The calculations left no room for error. The P-38G's fuel profile was exacting: 300 gallons in internal tanks, 60 in reserve, plus 330 gallons from drop tanks, totaling 690 gallons. Cruising at low altitude, each engine consumed roughly 50 gallons per hour, with usage rising at higher altitudes or during hard maneuvering. Mission planning estimated 4 hours and 30 minutes of flight time under ideal conditions, leaving just over an hour of safety margin, barely sufficient for unforeseen headwinds or evasive maneuvers. Captain Thomas George Lanier, Jr., having studied the mission profile repeatedly, memorized every detail. Son of a decorated World War I aviator who had served on General Billy Mitchell's staff, Lanier combined tactical skill with political acumen. Standing 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a commanding presence, he already claimed 5 aerial victories, some contested. His aggressive style and flair for self-promotion made him both admired and controversial within the squadron. At 27, he viewed the Yamamoto mission as an opportunity to secure personal fame and future political capital. Lieutenant Rex Theodore Barber represented the polar opposite of Lanier's temperament. A native of Culver, Oregon, and former engineering student at Oregon State College, Barber brought methodical precision to the cockpit. Unlike Lanier, Barber sought efficiency over spectacle. His aerial victories were earned through calculated positioning and accurate fire rather than daring aerobatics. At 25, he possessed an extraordinary spatial awareness of three-dimensional combat geometry, translating his engineering training into decisive performance in the air. Meanwhile, at Lacuna Airfield in Rabaul, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto reviewed his forward inspection schedule aboard a Mitsubishi G4M1 Type 1 bomber, the Betty. The aircraft exemplified Japanese design philosophy, capable and innovative, yet constrained by compromises in armor, defensive armament, and survivability. With every detail of the itinerary carefully noted, Yamamoto's staff coordinated timings, escort allocations, and contingency measures, a planning precision that would soon confront the full weight of American operational analysis, range calculations, and radar-directed fighter control. The Mitsubishi A6M3 Model 32-0 possessed an operational range of nearly 2,850 miles, achieved at the expense of armor and the absence of self-sealing fuel tanks. Its maximum speed reached 265 miles per hour at roughly 19,700 feet, with a standard cruising speed near 200 miles per hour. The aircraft's vulnerability to fire earned it the grim moniker Hamaki, or cigar, among Japanese airmen, a reference to its tendency to ignite instantly when struck. For Yamamoto's inspection mission, 6 of these fighters from the 204th Air Group were assigned as escorts to protect the Admiral and his staff. At 59, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto remained Japan's preeminent strategic mind. Born Isoroku Takano and later adopted by the Yamamoto family, he was only 5 feet 3 inches, yet carried the presence and dignity expected of a samurai descendant. A reminder of his early combat experience rested on his left hand. The index and middle fingers had been lost to shrapnel during the Battle of Tsushima Strait on May 27, 1905, when a gun turret aboard the armored cruiser Nishin exploded. The injury did not diminish his talents. He continued to excel at calligraphy, mastered poker, and commanded unwavering respect through sheer force of personality. Yamamoto's time at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921 left an indelible impression. Hitchhiking across the United States, he studied industrial centers firsthand: automobile factories in Detroit, oil refineries in Texas, and aircraft plants in California. He emerged with a clear, if pessimistic, understanding of American industrial capacity, concluding that any war with the United States would be unwinnable beyond an initial period of minor successes, a belief he later summarized as 6 months of running wild before inevitable defeat. For the United States, the mission's success depended entirely on the security of intercepted communications. If Japanese naval authorities suspected that JN-25 codes were compromised, they would cancel or reroute Yamamoto's flight. The cryptanalysis team at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, formerly stationed Hypo, had been decoding Japanese naval signals since before Midway. Their skills had progressed from fragmented decrypts to near-complete recovery of critical operational messages, providing the intelligence backbone for what would become one of the most daring fighter interception missions in history. Acting on the decoded message required authorization from the highest echelons. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet; Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific area; Rear Admiral Mark Mitchell, overseeing the Solomon Islands operations; and ultimately President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who reportedly gave the direct order, "Get Yamamoto." Planning the operation fell to a team of officers working in careful coordination. Marine Major John Condon, operations officer for Commander Aircraft Solomons, drafted the initial flight plan, calculating navigation waypoints and fuel usage. Commander John W. Mitchell, reviewing the plan, rejected it as incompatible with the P-38 Lightning's performance. He recalculated every parameter, working overnight with his pilots to craft a route that balanced operational range, fuel reserves, and risk of detection. The finalized flight plan consisted of 5 precisely measured legs, each mapped to avoid radar and coastal observers, while accounting for wind drift, magnetic variation, and potential deviations in airspeed. Every mile, every waypoint, and every turn had been computed to the limit of operational feasibility. The success of the mission would depend on strict adherence to timing, navigation, and fuel management, a convergence of technology, skill, and mathematical precision. Intelligence assessments indicated that several factors aligned favorably for the mission. The target date, April 18, 1943, coincided with the 1-year anniversary of the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, adding symbolic weight to the operation. Weather projections predicted mostly clear skies with excellent visibility, and, most importantly, Japanese Naval Command appeared unaware that their encrypted communications had been penetrated. Routine radio traffic reflected standard operational patterns, showing no increase in security measures. If American forces maintained strict operational secrecy, the element of surprise could be absolute. The Zero fighter escort, however, remained a major tactical consideration. The Mitsubishi A6M3 Model 32 excelled at low and medium altitude maneuvering, capable of reaching 336 miles per hour at roughly 19,700 feet, with a climb rate of 3,100 feet per minute and a turning radius under 1,000 feet. These performance characteristics stemmed from radical weight-saving measures. The aircraft's empty weight was only 3,980 pounds, compared with the 12,780-pound P-38 Lightning. Armor was minimal. A single 55mm piece of bullet-resistant glass protected the pilot, and fuel tanks were non-self-sealing, leaving the aircraft highly vulnerable to incendiary fire. Structurally, the Zero met only the bare minimum standards. In a sustained turning engagement below 20,000 feet, it could easily outmaneuver a P-38. Yet in high-speed diving attacks, leveraging firepower and structural robustness, the Lightning retained decisive advantages.
Lieutenant Besby Frank Holmes, who had studied Japanese air tactics during operations in the Solomons, observed that Zero pilots typically flew in close escort, maintaining a position 1,000 to 1,500 feet above and slightly behind their bombers in formations of 2 or 3 aircraft. Standard Japanese doctrine dictated that these escorts would engage any attacking fighters while bombers pressed on toward their target, relying on speed and defensive armament for protection. Analysis of past encounters revealed a pattern. When surprised, Japanese formations frequently reacted slowly to attacks from unconventional angles, particularly from below and behind. The key to mission success would be achieving complete tactical surprise despite a daylight approach over 600 miles of open ocean. On the evening of April 17, 1943, mission briefings commenced at 2,000 hours in the operations tent, packed with the pilots who would execute the strike. Rear Admiral Nark Mitcher, commander of aircraft Solomons, addressed the group personally. Having commanded the USS Hornet during the Doolittle raid a year earlier, Mitcher fully understood both the operational and symbolic significance of the mission. The plan involved 18 P-38 Lightnings. 4 aircraft were designated as the killer flight, tasked with engaging the bombers directly. 12 would provide top cover to counter any response from enemy fighters at Kahili Airfield, approximately 750 miles distant. 2 additional aircraft were assigned as spares in case of mechanical failure. Selected for the killer flight were Captain Thomas Lanier Jr., Lieutenant Rex T. Barber, Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and Lieutenant Raymond K. Hine, with Lieutenants James McClanahan and Joe Moore as reserves. Mitcher's navigation plan reflected both ingenuity and necessity, born of extensive overwater experience. The route was divided into 5 precise legs. First, a magnetic heading of 265 degrees for 55 minutes at 30 to 50 feet above the water, covering 183 miles. Second, 290 degrees for 27 minutes, 89 miles. Third, 305 degrees for 38 minutes, 125 miles. Fourth, 330 degrees for 16 minutes, 52 miles. And finally, 290 degrees for 21 minutes, climbing to the designated attack altitude while covering 70 miles. Each leg was carefully plotted to avoid Japanese observation posts on New Georgia, Vella Lavella, and the Treasury Islands, while compensating for predicted wind drift. Navigation margin for error was effectively 0. Even a 1-degree deviation sustained over the distance would result in missing the target with insufficient fuel to correct. Pilot survival gear highlighted the extreme risk of the mission. Each aircraft carried a Mae West life preserver in the event of a water landing, though the odds of survival in shark-infested waters were minimal. Every detail, from flight path to fuel calculations, from formation strategy to contingency equipment, was meticulously planned, reflecting a balance of human skill, machine capability, and mathematical precision. Success or failure would depend on perfect execution over a vast and hostile ocean expanse. Each pilot's survival kit was carefully prepared for the possibility of ditching over the Pacific or enemy-controlled islands. Packs contained water purification tablets, concentrated emergency rations, fishing line, and basic first aid supplies designed for use in the dense jungle and coastal regions of the Solomons. Every aviator carried a Colt M1911A1 45 caliber sidearm with multiple magazines, fully aware that capture by Japanese forces almost certainly meant execution. Intelligence reports from rescued American prisoners detailed increasingly brutal treatment, including beheadings, medical experiments conducted without anesthesia, and confirmed cases of cannibalism. For the pilots, running out of fuel over open water was tantamount to a death sentence, while mechanical failure over Japanese-held territory could be even deadlier.
Lieutenant Colonel Luther S. Moore, the squadron's meteorologist, conducted a final review of weather data. Surface winds blew from the southeast at 8 knots. 5,000-foot winds originated from the south at 15 knots, and 10,000-foot winds shifted from the southwest at 22 knots. Tropical weather patterns in the Solomon Islands were notoriously volatile, with rapidly developing squalls and towering cumulus clouds capable of forming in under an hour. Moore calculated a 70% likelihood of favorable conditions, but any sudden storm along the route could jeopardize the mission entirely. The pilots would maintain strict radio silence until visual contact with the enemy. P-38 aircraft radios had been specially tuned to 6,710 kilocycles to reduce the risk of detection, but even a single transmission could alert Japanese observers. Navigational responsibility fell entirely to Major John Mitchell, who would guide all 18 aircraft using dead reckoning, compass readings, airspeed indicators, time calculations, and mental plotting. Over the endless Pacific swells, without radio beacons or prominent landmarks, a single miscalculation could doom the flight. Lieutenant Julius Jack Jacobson conducted a final inspection of his aircraft's armament. The P-38's 4 Browning A&M .50 caliber machine guns carried 500 rounds each, combining ball, armor-piercing, and incendiary ammunition. Rate of fire ranged from 750 to 850 rounds per minute per gun. The nose-mounted 20mm Hispano M2 cannon contained 150 rounds of high-explosive and armor-piercing shells. Together, this firepower created a narrow but lethal convergence zone capable of cutting through a bomber's wing spar in seconds. Yet the weaponry's limitations were strict. Maximum continuous fire provided fewer than 37 seconds for the machine guns and less than 12 seconds for the cannon. Every burst had to count. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 18th, ground crews performed meticulous final preparations under the supervision of Master Sergeant Leo B. Godfrey. Ammunition belts were carefully loaded with the prescribed mix of ball, armor-piercing, and incendiary rounds in a 4:1:1 ratio. Internal fuel tanks were topped to 360 gallons, with each drop tank filled to 160 gallons. Every attachment, shackle, and control surface was inspected to ensure proper function, as a single failure could prevent takeoff or create catastrophic drag in flight. Meanwhile, the Japanese 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul followed strict protocols for transporting high-ranking officers. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commander of the Southeast Area Fleet and Yamamoto's subordinate, had advised against the inspection tour. American fighter activity in the region had surged since the Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal in February. Intelligence suggested nearly 200 American fighters were operating from Guadalcanal, the Russell Islands, and forward bases. Despite this, Yamamoto insisted on personally visiting his pilots to commend them for Operation I-Go, a recent Japanese air offensive claiming exaggerated successes against Allied shipping. Reports had credited the loss of 1 cruiser, 2 destroyers, and 25 transports, when actual losses amounted only to 1 destroyer, 1 corvette, 1 tanker, and 2 cargo ships. At Lakunai Airfield, Chief Petty Officer Hiroshi Hayashi oversaw final preparations for Yamamoto's aircraft. Betty Bomber tail number 323 of the 705th Air Group was selected for its exceptional maintenance record and engine reliability. The aircraft had flown 47 prior missions without significant mechanical issues. Extra fuel tanks had been installed in the bomb bay to ensure sufficient reserves for the long overwater flight. Every detail, from aircraft integrity to fuel load, had been scrutinized to maximize the chances of completing the mission safely. Admiral Yamamoto's seat was installed on the left side behind the pilot, offering an unobstructed view for aerial observation. A custom mount secured his personal katana, a family heirloom dating back to the 16th century Momoyama period. The aircraft was escorted by 6 fighters from the 204th Air Group, an elite unit seasoned by repeated engagements over the Solomon Islands. Each pilot averaged more than 500 combat hours, including Petty Officer First Class Shoei Sugita, who would go on to become one of Japan's top aces with over 70 confirmed kills before his death in April 1945. Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanaga, a veteran of 100 missions, also flew in protection of the combined fleet commander, taking pride in the responsibility. These aviators had extensive experience facing American aircraft, including P-38 Lightnings, P-39 Airacobras, P-40 Warhawks, and F-4 Wildcats. The P-38's high-speed advantage diminished below 15,000 feet due to compressibility effects, while the Zero's power-to-weight ratio and agility at low altitude gave Japanese pilots an edge in turning engagements. Below 20,000 feet, the Zeros could outmaneuver the Lightnings, although the American aircraft retained superiority in firepower and armor. At 07:25 local time, 05:25 Tokyo time, on April 18th, Mitchell's P-38s commenced their takeoff from Fighter Strip number 2 at Henderson Field. The departure sequence had been meticulously choreographed to conserve fuel and minimize exposure. Mitchell led the formation, followed by his 3-plane flight, then Lanier's killer flight, with the cover flights behind. Immediately, mechanical issues began to affect the operation. Lieutenant James McLanahan's aircraft suffered a blown tire during the takeoff roll, skidding off the coral runway and damaging the right wheel assembly. Unable to continue, he was forced to abort. Lieutenant Joe Moore experienced a fuel transfer pump failure during climb-out, preventing access to his drop tank fuel, necessitating an immediate return. The mission now proceeded with 16 P-38s, reducing the already narrow margin for error. Mitchell led the formation at a perilously low altitude of 30 to 50 feet above the ocean, exploiting the radar blind spot to minimize detection by Japanese installations. Salt spray quickly coated the windshields, requiring constant wiping, while the pilots relied entirely on visual references to maintain formation. Radio silence was absolute, placing complete responsibility for navigation and coordination on the lead. For over 2 hours, the pilots maintained tight formation at extreme low altitude. Every adjustment of throttle and propeller pitch demanded constant attention. The repetitive motion of the Pacific swells beneath them created a hypnotic rhythm, challenging concentration. Pilots later recalled the struggle against drowsiness, employing methods ranging from slapping their own faces to singing aloud to remain alert. The sun heated the cockpits to stifling levels, intensifying the physical strain despite the slipstream cooling effect. Lieutenant Roger J. Ames, assigned to the cover flight, monitored fuel consumption with increasing concern. Drag from the drop tanks, potentially worsened by minor attachment misalignments or production variances, was higher than predicted. At current rates, he calculated only about 5 minutes of reserve fuel would remain after completing the return leg. The stakes were absolute. Overconsumption risked stranding aircraft at sea, while excessive conservation could reduce combat effectiveness at the interception point. Each pilot continuously balanced these variables, making constant micro-adjustments to throttle and propeller pitch, ensuring both survival and mission success.
The twin Allison engines of the P-38s hummed steadily.
a continuous mechanical drone that became almost meditative over the long hours of flight. At 0600 Tokyo time, 0800 local, Admiral Yamamoto's two-aircraft formation departed Rabaul precisely according to schedule. The admiral wore his ceremonial white uniform adorned with the Order of the Chrysanthemum and the Order of the Golden Kite, a deliberate display of Imperial Navy prestige intended to inspire the forward-deployed personnel. Observers later noted that Yamamoto appeared unusually contemplative, and several staff officers would later report that he seemed uneasy, as if sensing the weight of the mission. Vice Admiral Mate Mugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff and longtime confidant, was aboard Betty Bomber No. 326, accompanied by senior officers of the combined fleet. The formation steadily climbed to 6,500 feet, while the escorting Zeros maneuvered into two three-plane sections, maintaining textbook spacing and altitude. Visibility was exceptional. Scattered cumulus clouds between 4,000 and 5,000 feet occasionally provided natural concealment, although the Japanese aircrew relied more on standard formation discipline than on environmental factors. Warrant Officer Kenji Yanaga, flying in Zero-Tail No. 3081, scanned the skies with the trained precision honed through 3 years of continuous combat. His instincts, nearly instinctual, allowed him to identify aircraft types at distances that would appear only as tiny specks to less experienced pilots. Peripheral vision picked up the slightest shifts against cloud formations, yet his focus on maintaining formation integrity remained absolute. The flight from Rabaul to Balale was a routine route, executed dozens of times without incident. American fighter incursions in this sector were historically non-existent, so operational mishaps rather than enemy attacks were considered the primary risk. At 0934 local time, Mitchell's P-38 formation reached the final navigation waypoint with remarkable accuracy. 2 hours and 9 minutes had been spent over open ocean, relying entirely on dead reckoning, compass, clock, and airspeed indicators without reference to any landmarks. Mitchell cross-checked his synchronized Elgin watch with the calculated position. Any error in heading, wind drift, or timing could cause the entire strike force to miss the target by miles. With precision, he waggled his wings to signal the turn, and all 16 Lightnings banked in unison, heading northwest toward Bougainville. They were precisely 1 minute ahead of the projected intercept schedule, having traversed 410 miles of featureless ocean. Lieutenant Douglas S. Canning, in the No. 2 position as Mitchell's wingman, was the first to identify the objective. "Bogies, 11 o'clock high," he announced at 0934, breaking radio silence for the first time. Approximately 5 miles distant and separated by 6,000 feet in altitude, the enemy formation consisted of 2 Betty bombers in perfect echelon and 6 Zeros arranged in 2 flights of 3. The Japanese aircrew remained entirely unaware of the 16 Lightnings ascending toward them from below and behind, as if the P-38s had materialized from the ocean itself. Mitchell felt a surge of controlled adrenaline. The painstaking calculations, the careful navigation, and the exhaustive training of his pilots had produced a result that seemed almost impossible. They had located the proverbial needle in the vast Pacific haystack. Mitchell gave the immediate order to jettison the auxiliary fuel tanks. "Drop the tanks! All flights! Now!" The 165-gallon external tanks fell away, tumbling toward the Pacific, shedding the P-38s of the drag that had constrained their speed. The twin Allison engines were pushed to war emergency settings, producing 1,475 horsepower per side. The Lightnings surged forward, accelerating past 300 miles per hour while climbing at a sustained maximum rate of approximately 2,800 feet per minute.
The killer flight prepared to engage the Japanese bombers directly, while Mitchell ascended with the top cover section to intercept any response from Kahili Airfield. Captain Lanier immediately spotted the enemy Zeros beginning to react. The escort fighters had identified the approaching P-38s and were dropping their own external tanks as they peeled off to intercept.
the standard doctrine of protecting the bombers by engaging attacking aircraft. In a decisive moment, Lanier made a split-second tactical choice that would be debated for decades. Rather than continuing toward the bombers with Lieutenant Barber, he turned to confront the diving Zeros directly. According to his later justification, the maneuver was intended to neutralize the escort threat, providing Barber an unobstructed run on the primary target. Critics have argued that the move prioritized personal glory over mission objectives, giving Lanier the chance for easier fighter kills. Meanwhile, Barber pressed onward toward the bombers, entering a steep descent aimed at minimizing the P-38 speed advantage by hugging the jungle canopy below. The lead Betty bomber pitched sharply into a dive, attempting to use the tree copse as cover. Barber followed in his Lightning, entering a 45-degree dive, his airspeed rapidly climbing past 400 miles per hour. The distance between attacker and target closed rapidly, 2,000 yards, then 1,500, 1,000. At 500 yards, Barber opened fire with all forward-firing weapons. Streams of .50 caliber rounds and 20mm cannon shells converged on the bomber's right engine and wing structure. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The right engine detonated in flames, the wing spar severed, and the Betty rolled violently to port, completely uncontrollable. Barber yanked his P-38 upward to avoid collision, enduring intense G-forces as he watched the flaming fuselage strike the jungle canopy, trailing debris and smoke. One bomber was down, but which carried Yamamoto remained unknown. Barber's search for the second bomber was complicated by the separation of Lieutenant Holmes and Lieutenant Hine, who had initially followed him but had become scattered in the violent maneuvers. Holmes identified the second Betty flying low over the water, skimming the Bougainville coastline. Vice Admiral Ugaki's pilot had opted for a different escape route, hugging the ocean to reduce exposure from below. Holmes approached the target aggressively, but his closure rate was excessive. A sustained burst damaged the Betty's right engine, producing a white vapor trail of leaking fuel and oil, yet failed to deliver a decisive blow. Barber then reacquired the bomber. It was barely 50 feet above the waves, trailing smoke from its crippled engine. He carefully calculated a deflection shot, leading the aircraft by 30 degrees to account for its speed. The initial rounds struck water spray as he aimed, then impacted the fuselage. Large metal fragments tore away, some striking Barber's own aircraft with audible impact. The left engine caught fire. The Japanese pilot attempted a controlled water landing, but collided with the surface at over 100 miles per hour, splitting the aircraft as wings and fuselage separated upon impact. Meanwhile, Lanier engaged the escort Zeros in a violent vertical scissors maneuver. Using the P-38's superior speed, he maintained energy while the more nimble Zeros relied on turning to match him. Lanier claimed one kill, describing a roll-inverted attack into a Zero's wing route that resulted in a catastrophic explosion. Japanese records, however, indicate no loss of escort fighters. The remaining Zeros, under Warrant Officer Yanagari, prioritized protecting the bombers over pursuing a lethal engagement. Their mission, protecting the bombers, had already been decisively compromised.
From above, Mitchell's top-cover flight maintained vigilance for intercepting fighters from Kahili Airfield, situated 20 miles from the contact point. The anticipated large-scale counterattack of 750 aircraft never materialized. The Japanese defenses were effectively neutralized before they could respond, leaving the P-38s in complete control of the engagement. The Japanese response appeared minimal, suggesting either complete tactical surprise or that their fighters were committed elsewhere. Mitchell maintained a commanding altitude of 18,000 feet, poised to dive on any interceptors attempting to climb into engagement. Below, the killer flight completed their attacks and began the return leg.
The entire confrontation had consumed less than 10 minutes, with actual combat lasting only around 3. The ultimate success of the mission depended entirely on which bomber had transported Admiral Yamamoto. Lieutenant Barber's P-38 had suffered extensive damage. Enemy fire from the Betty's defensive 7.7mm Type 92 machine guns, and possibly from escorting Zeros, had left 104 perforations in the fuselage. Hydraulic fluid leaked from severed lines, leaving thin reddish trails along the aircraft's body. One engine ran unevenly, perhaps due to ingested debris or battle damage, but both Allison power plants remained operational, and the Lightning retained controllable flight characteristics. As Barber and his fellow pilots commenced the long trek back across hundreds of miles of open ocean, every instrument, gauge, and vibration became a potential signal of impending failure. Fuel reserves were dangerously low in multiple aircraft. Lieutenant Holmes, grappling with engine issues, was forced to throttle back and gradually fell behind the formation. Despite the instinct to communicate, radio discipline remained partially intact. Each pilot relied on calculations, estimating whether their remaining fuel would suffice to reach base. In 16 separate cockpits, the arithmetic of survival unfolded simultaneously, every decision calibrated to gallons of aviation gasoline. Approaching the Russell Islands, roughly 200 miles from Guadalcanal, some aviators confronted critical choices. Lieutenant Hines' fuel indicators registered perilously low levels. He could have diverted to the emergency airstrip on Banaka Island, but reports of Japanese submarine activity made any landing a gamble with potentially fatal consequences. Placing faith in his calculations and the resilience of the Allison engines, he pressed onward. Mitchell's navigation throughout the return route proved equally flawless, guiding the scattered formation towards safety. Gradually, the P-38s reassembled as they neared Guadalcanal. At precisely 12:30 local time, Fighter Strip 2 appeared, exactly as Mitchell had predicted. Several aircraft were running on fumes. Holmes landed with both engines sputtering, fuel tanks effectively dry. Others touched down with less than 10 gallons remaining, mere minutes of flight. The margin between disaster and success had been measured in finite quantities of fuel. Ground crews immediately swarmed the returning aircraft, counting bullet holes, inspecting battle damage, and performing quick assessments. The question on every mind was immediate and pressing. Had the mission achieved its objective? Which of the bombers had carried Yamamoto? Pilots could report only that 2 Japanese bombers had been destroyed. Identifying the primary target amid the chaos of high-speed attack had been impossible. Determining the true outcome of the mission would require observation of Japanese reaction. The waiting period promised to be tense and uncertain.
As night fell over the tropical Guadalcanal, the pilots gathered at the Officers' Club, a makeshift structure of salvaged lumber and repurposed materials. Captain Lanier, acutely aware of the potential publicity, began recounting the operation in his own terms, emphasizing his role in the success. The full story of the interception and its historical impact would emerge only after intelligence corroborated which bomber had been destroyed. But for the returning aviators, the completion of the mission marked both a technical and personal triumph under conditions that tested skill, endurance, and courage to the limit. Captain Lanier later asserted that he had personally destroyed Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft, claiming an elaborate vertical reversal maneuver that placed him above the bomber while firing. This account, however, implied the impossible, simultaneously engaging enemy escort fighters and attacking the bombers. Lieutenant Barber, by contrast, maintained a restrained version of events, describing a direct, stern pursuit of the lead bomber that aligned with observed flight paths and battle damage. Japanese recovery teams located the wreckage of Yamamoto's bomber on April 19th, scattered across dense jungle approximately 4 miles inland from Moyer Point, near the village of Aku on Bougainville. The operation was led by Lieutenant Commander Tabuchi Shigaru of the 26th Air Flotilla.
The admiral's body was found still secured in his seat, though thrown clear of the main fuselage. Even in death, he retained the dignified posture, his white-gloved hand clutching the ceremonial katana he had carried on the flight. Medical examination conducted by Dr. Tanaka identified 2 gunshot wounds, one traversing from below the left shoulder blade to above the right eye, the other striking the jaw. Death had been instantaneous, likely resulting from Barber's first firing pass. The psychological impact on the Imperial Japanese Navy was profound. Yamamoto was more than a senior commander. He symbolized the strategic intellect and tradition of Japan's naval forces. His deep understanding of combined fleet operations and the loyalty he inspired among subordinates made him irreplaceable. His measured recognition of American industrial and operational capacity had been one of the few restraints on overly ambitious Japanese planning. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, a staff officer who survived the second bomber crash with severe injuries, later described the admiral's death as creating an irreplaceable void. Watanabe had played shogi with Yamamoto the previous night and recalled a notable fatalism in the admiral's demeanor. Japanese intelligence immediately suspected that their codes had been compromised. The precise timing and location of the interception after a 600-mile flight suggested deliberate foreknowledge rather than coincidence. The date, April 18th, exactly a year after the Doolittle raid, added symbolic weight. Yet, acknowledging a code breach would have implied a catastrophic intelligence failure with far-reaching operational consequences. Instead, the official explanation maintained that Yamamoto had died during routine forward operations, masking the true nature of the targeted strike. On the American side, the initial response was deliberately muted. Public acknowledgement could risk revealing the cryptographic advantage that had been decisive at Midway and enabled the Yamamoto mission. President Roosevelt received the confirmation of success with cautious satisfaction, issuing strict orders for secrecy. Admiral Nimitz similarly expressed concern that publicity could expose the United States' signals intelligence capabilities. Consequently, for more than a month, the American public remained unaware not only of Yamamoto's death, but of the audacious interception that had eliminated him.
Disputes over the identity of Yamamoto's killer emerged immediately. Lanier, mindful of his reputation, aggressively publicized his version, which evolved over time to include impossible maneuvers, an extreme vertical reversal, and inverted attack from above. This narrative would have required Lanier to occupy 2 positions at once while performing maneuvers beyond the P-38's operational limits. Barber's account was more restrained and consistent with evidence. He reported a straightforward stern attack on the lead bomber, followed by a separate engagement with the second bomber. Japanese witnesses, including Zero pilot Yanaga, later confirmed seeing a single P-38 attack the lead bomber from below and behind, exactly as Barber described. Examination of Yamamoto's body revealed entry wounds from below and behind, corroborating Barber's trajectory. Likewise, the pattern of bullet holes throughout the wreckage aligned with Barber's account, rather than Lanier's inflated version from above. The debate over who had actually downed Admiral Yamamoto persisted for decades, creating lingering tensions among the airmen who had participated in the operation. In October 1943, a widely circulated article in Time magazine named Lanier, nearly compromising operational secrecy and sparking controversy within military circles. Decades later, in 1991, the U.S. Air Force issued a compromise decision, officially crediting both Lanier and Barber with half a kill each. This resolution satisfied no one, leaving historians and veterans frustrated. Comprehensive research in 2003, drawing on Japanese operational records, examination of the crash site, and eyewitness testimony, finally clarified the historical record. Lieutenant Barber alone had delivered the fatal attack that destroyed Yamamoto's aircraft. Major John Mitchell, who had expertly navigated the mission across 600 miles of open ocean using dead reckoning, received the Navy Cross rather than the Medal of Honor initially recommended.
Navy leadership had been angered by earlier security breaches stemming from premature publicity. Every pilot on the mission received the Navy Cross in recognition of the extreme danger and strategic significance of their operation, but Mitchell's singular skill in navigation and target acquisition merited distinction beyond the compromises imposed by inter-service politics. Operation Vengeance offered critical technical and tactical insights that influenced U.S. fighter aircraft development for the remainder of World War II. The P-38 Lightning's unprecedented combination of extended range, superior firepower, and twin-engine reliability proved indispensable for missions where single-engine fighters would have been unable to return from extreme distances. The aircraft's concentrated nose-mounted armament delivered rapid and devastating results against heavily defended bombers, a capability that wing-mounted guns could not match. These lessons informed the design and operational doctrines for later long-range escort fighters, such as the P-51D Mustang, which would dominate the European theater. The consequences for Japanese naval aviation were severe and immediate. Admiral Koga, Yamamoto's successor, lacked both the strategic foresight and personal authority of his predecessor, and would perish in an aircraft accident less than a year later, in March 1944. With their senior leadership destabilized, Japanese naval operations became increasingly erratic, prioritizing desperate tactical responses over coherent strategy. The decisive fleet engagement Yamamoto had envisioned, designed to cripple American carrier forces, never materialized. Instead, Japanese carrier aviation deteriorated through sustained attrition, suffering catastrophic losses in engagements such as the Marianas Turkey Shoot and the Battle of Leyte Gulf.
Beyond operational consequences, Yamamoto's death dealt a profound psychological blow to the Japanese Navy. Propaganda had elevated him to near-mythical status as an invincible strategist, capable of securing Japan's ultimate victory. The elimination of such a symbol of national and naval prestige shattered this image, eroding morale and removing a critical voice of strategic caution from Japanese military planning. The vacuum left by Yamamoto's absence marked a turning point from which Japanese naval aviation would never fully recover and underscored the decisive impact of carefully planned, intelligence-driven operations on the course of the Pacific War. The successful targeting and elimination of Admiral Yamamoto posed profound questions about Japan's strategic vulnerability. If even a figure of such rank and operational importance could be hunted down across hundreds of miles of open ocean, the Japanese military could no longer count on the inviolability of its leadership or communication networks. Morale among Japan's armed forces began a gradual deterioration, accelerated by subsequent operational failures. Early triumphs had instilled a sense of overconfidence within Japanese strategic planning, but the loss of Yamamoto marked a turning point, ushering in growing apprehension and a sense of impending crisis. American capabilities in signals intelligence remained a decisive factor throughout the Pacific Campaign. Japanese naval command never fully admitted the extent to which their encryption had been compromised. Instead of undertaking comprehensive reforms, they made only minor adjustments to codes and procedures, leaving critical vulnerabilities exposed. This failure contributed directly to the catastrophic losses suffered during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in what would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American fighters systematically annihilated Japanese carrier-based aviation. The mission's success relied on extraordinary coordination between multiple branches of the American military. Naval cryptographers, including Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, had first intercepted and decoded the vital intelligence. Marine Major John Condon provided the initial mission planning, while Army Air Force pilots executed the complex interception over the open Pacific. This joint effort, rarely seen in other Pacific campaigns, demonstrated the operational advantages of unified command structures and inter-service collaboration. Lessons drawn from this operation influenced American doctrine for the remainder of World War II and shaped post-war military planning for precision strikes and long-range fighter operations.
Admiral Yamamoto's death represented more than the elimination of a senior commander. Among Japanese leaders, he alone possessed a nuanced understanding of American industrial potential and political resolve. His oft-quoted reflection that Japan could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, but no longer, encapsulated his assessment that a prolonged war against the United States was unsustainable. The replacement of such a strategically literate commander with leaders who prioritized ideology and spiritual confidence over material realities accelerated Japan's trajectory toward defeat. The timing of the operation amplified its symbolic weight. Carried out on April 18, 1943, it fell precisely 1 year after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, underscoring America's capacity to strike deeply and selectively against Japanese leadership. The operation demonstrated that no commander, regardless of rank or reputation, could be considered invulnerable. The psychological shock reverberated across the Japanese military hierarchy, creating doubt, hesitation, and a pervasive sense of insecurity in subsequent strategic planning.
Technical evaluation of the mission revealed both the capabilities and constraints of American fighter operations. The P-38 Lightning's range, firepower, and reliability had been instrumental in achieving success, validating lessons in long-range interception, over-water navigation, and the tactical use of concentrated nose-mounted armament. At the same time, the mission highlighted the razor-thin margins for error inherent in such operations. Fuel calculations, navigation precision, and pilot endurance were all critical factors, where even minor miscalculations could have resulted in catastrophic failure. The Yamamoto mission would remain a benchmark of intelligence-driven precision warfare, illustrating the lethal interplay of strategy, technology, and human skill. The P-38 Lightnings had been flown to the extreme limits of their operational endurance. Several aircraft returned with fuel tanks virtually empty, underscoring the narrow margin between mission success and disaster. A mere half-hour delay in Yamamoto's departure could have forced the fighters to search fruitlessly over hundreds of miles of ocean, exhausting precious fuel reserves and risking loss of aircraft and crews. The mission's delicate balance had been measured in minutes and gallons, emphasizing the ongoing need for extended-range fighters and more efficient fuel management technologies. Meteorological conditions played an equally critical role. Exceptional visibility at the point of interception enabled pilots to acquire targets visually at maximum range. Scattered cloud formations along the return path offered occasional concealment from potential Japanese interceptors. Had a tropical storm developed anywhere along the flight route, the operation would have been aborted. Pilots often spoke of weather gods choosing sides, and on April 18, 1943, fortune clearly favored the Americans. Even minor changes in wind direction or intensity could have doomed the mission. Japanese attempts to mask the gravity of Yamamoto's death revealed the significance of the loss. For over a month, state-controlled media continued issuing statements in his name, maintaining the illusion that he remained operational. Official acknowledgement of his passing came only on May 21, 1943, framing it as a casualty incurred during forward operations. The formal state funeral on June 5 drew hundreds of thousands of mourners along the streets of Tokyo, an unprecedented demonstration of respect. Hirohito himself attended, highlighting Yamamoto's extraordinary stature within the Imperial Navy. Portions of his ashes were interred at Tama Cemetery in Tokyo, with the remainder enshrined at the family temple in Nagoya. For the American pilots who executed the mission, the emotional consequences were complex. They had eliminated a highly respected adversary, a commander widely acknowledged for his strategic brilliance. Yamamoto had opposed a conflict with the United States, understanding its ultimate futility. Yet he had orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor, making him a valid target under wartime rules of engagement. Many participants wrestled with the ethical dimensions of targeted assassination for years afterward. Intelligence officer Edwin Layton, who had advocated for the mission's approval, reflected on the operation with ambivalence. Having known Yamamoto personally during pre-war diplomatic interactions, Layton recognized the admiral's strategic insight as grounded in realism rather than mere nationalism or ideology. At the same time, he understood that eliminating Yamamoto would save countless American lives by disrupting Japanese naval planning. The operation demonstrated the integrated superiority of American military capabilities. Signals intelligence provided critical targeting information. The P-38's extended range offered the physical means to reach the target. Precise navigation ensured the strike's accuracy. Yet human skill remained decisive. Major Mitchell's flawless navigation, Lieutenant Barber's disciplined marksmanship, and the ground crew's meticulous preparation converted technical potential into operational success. The coordination of human expertise with mechanical performance would remain a hallmark of American advantage throughout the Pacific Campaign. Post-war analyses highlighted how close the mission had come to failure at multiple points. If Lieutenant Douglas Canning had not identified the Japanese formation at precisely the right moment, the P-38s could have flown past their objective entirely. If Barber had hesitated during the lead bomber's dive, Yamamoto might have reached the jungle and escaped. If Lieutenant Holmes had inflicted damage on the second bomber, allowing Barber to complete the strike, surviving personnel could have alerted the Japanese to compromised communications. Every element of the operation had held under immense pressure, but only just.
Detailed squadron records emphasized the razor-thin margins. Fuel consumption logs showed several aircraft operating beyond calculated ranges, relying on favorable tailwinds and careful engine management to return safely. Ammunition expenditure reports indicate Barber used roughly 70% of his rounds across both attack runs. Maintenance logs documented extensive combat damage, reflecting the intensity of defensive fire from the bombers and escort fighters. The strategic ramifications of Yamamoto's death extended well beyond the immediate military consequences. His elimination deprived Japan of its foremost strategist, weakening operational planning, undermining morale, and creating opportunities for American forces to exploit Japanese vulnerabilities for the remainder of the war. Admiral Yamamoto's death removed the single Japanese commander most capable of advocating for pragmatic strategy as the war increasingly turned against the empire. He had recognized the limits of Japan's industrial and logistical capacity, understanding that a protracted conflict with the United States would inevitably end in defeat. With him gone, his successors lacked both the strategic foresight and the political influence necessary to pursue realistic options, instead relying on increasingly desperate measures that prolonged hostilities and amplified casualties. The emergence of kamikaze operations later in the war exemplified the strategic vacuum left by his loss. Meteorological data from April 18, 1943 confirmed conditions uniquely favorable to the mission. Visibility along the P-38's flight corridor exceeded 10 miles for the majority of the route, while cloud cover remained intermittent rather than solid. Wind speeds and directions closely aligned with pre-mission forecasts, creating a rare alignment of factors in the notoriously volatile tropical environment of the Solomon Islands. Such optimal conditions were estimated to occur perhaps 1 day in 10, emphasizing the mission's reliance on a narrow window of opportunity that might not have recurred for several weeks. The intelligence effort underpinning Operation Vengeance represented an extraordinary feat of coordination and secrecy. Hundreds of cryptanalysts, translators, and intelligence specialists at Station Hypo and related facilities worked for months, decoding Japanese naval communications without revealing their capabilities. Their contributions, largely invisible to the public, formed the foundation of the mission. In essence, the cryptographers had provided the weapon. The pilots merely delivered it. Without this meticulous work, the precise interception of Yamamoto's flight would have been impossible. Examination of the wreckage of the lead Betty bomber highlighted the effectiveness of the P-38's concentrated forward armament. The 4.50 caliber machine guns, combined with the 20mm cannon, produced a destructive convergence zone roughly 30 inches in diameter at typical engagement ranges. Within this area, structural integrity was instantly compromised. Aluminum airframes shredded, control cables severed, fuel lines ruptured, and crew casualties inflicted immediately. No amount of conventional armor could have survived such focused fire. The failure of the Zero escorts to shield the bombers revealed a critical flaw in Japanese tactical doctrine. Their training dictated that escorts engage attacking aircraft aggressively, rather than maintaining continuous close protection over the primary assets. This predictable reaction permitted Barber's attack on the bombers, while Landfair diverted the attention of the escorting Zeros. American pilots would repeatedly exploit this rigid tactical pattern in subsequent operations, demonstrating the advantage gained through adaptability and initiative. In sum, the Yamamoto mission illustrated the confluence of intelligence mastery, technical innovation, favorable environmental conditions, and human skill. It underscored how weaknesses in enemy doctrine, combined with meticulous preparation and precision execution, could transform an extraordinarily high-risk operation into a decisive strategic success.
Admiral Chester Nimitz's authorization of the mission reflected a careful weighing of risk against potential gain. Any failure, particularly one involving substantial American losses, could have exposed U.S. code-breaking capabilities without achieving strategic results. Premature publicity risked prompting the Japanese to alter their encryption entirely. Yet Nimitz accepted these dangers because Yamamoto was an irreplaceable figure in Japanese naval command, a strategist whose loss would have consequences beyond the battlefield. History ultimately affirmed the prudence of this decision. The planning process for Operation Vengeance showcased the depth of American operational competence. Planners evaluated multiple courses of action, rejecting alternatives deemed too risky or impractical. Contingency protocols addressed potential mechanical failures, navigational errors, and environmental hazards. Meteorological data was scrutinized for hours, fuel consumption calculated to precise volumes, and all factors cross-checked for worst-case scenarios. This meticulous methodology, combining exhaustive preparation with the ability to adapt tactically, exemplified the American approach to complex wartime operations across the Pacific. Although the mission bore the name Operation Vengeance, a reference to Pearl Harbor, the pilots themselves reported little personal sense of retribution. Their focus remained on the precise execution of a high-risk military objective. Satisfaction derived from mission accomplishment and survival, while the broader symbolic weight of avenging Pearl Harbor rested with strategic and political leadership. The operation illustrated the evolution of U.S. fighter doctrine, transitioning from purely defensive escort missions to deliberate offensive penetrations deep into enemy airspace. By April 1943, American pilots had honed both tactics and technology to strike decisively where previously they had merely defended. The mission's significance extended beyond the immediate tactical victory. It underscored how individual expertise, when combined with technological capability and coordinated intelligence, could produce results far greater than raw numerical strength. Precision code-breaking provided the intelligence, long-range aircraft served as the delivery system, and expert pilots translated opportunity into tangible results. Without this integration of human skill and machine performance, even superior technology would have been insufficient. Lessons from Operation Vengeance would inform American military thinking for decades, influencing doctrines in conflicts from Vietnam to modern counterterrorism operations. From a technical perspective, the P-38 Lightnings exemplified the synergy of range, firepower, and reliability. They demonstrated the ability to operate at the edge of mechanical endurance while delivering concentrated firepower with lethal accuracy. Pilots maintained complex calculations of fuel, speed, and positioning under extreme physical strain. Every component, from the cryptographers who decrypted enemy messages to the engineers who maintained aircraft, contributed to the seamless execution of the plan. The strategic consequences were profound. Yamamoto's removal deprived Japan of its most insightful military mind, one capable of realistically appraising American industrial and logistical power. His death left the Japanese command prone to overreach, relying on ideology rather than pragmatism, accelerating both tactical errors and ultimate defeat. The timing of the strike, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid,
carried deliberate symbolic resonance, demonstrated that American forces could strike decisively at the heart of Japanese command, regardless of distance or perceived security. On April 18, 1943, 18 American pilots launched on a mission many had considered nearly impossible. By the end of the day, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto lay in the dense jungle of Bougainville. Japanese naval strategy was irreparably weakened, and the trajectory of the Pacific War had shifted decisively in favor of the United States. The 16 P-38s that returned had pushed both human and mechanical limits, engaged in a precise, high-stakes encounter, and returned intact to Guadalcanal. In a few intense minutes, they achieved what conventional bombing campaigns could not: the surgical elimination of a pivotal enemy leader. Operation Vengeance demonstrated the potential of combined intelligence, technology, and human expertise. It marked the beginning of an era where targeted precision strikes could shape the course of conflict, changing not only the Pacific theater, but also the broader understanding of strategic warfare in the 20th century. The success of April 18th reflected careful planning, meticulous preparation, exceptional skill, and a measure of fortune. The operation's lessons, rigorous intelligence, flexible tactics, human proficiency, and technological advantage would resonate through subsequent military history, establishing a standard for how complex, high-risk missions could decisively influence the outcome of war.
April 14, 1943. Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, Pearl Harbor. In a dimly lit operations room, cryptographers labored over intercepted Japanese transmissions. Pencils scratched across log sheets as coded naval messages were meticulously converted into English. The latest transmission originated from the Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, outlining the inspection itinerary for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The decrypted schedule contained exact departure and arrival times, flight routes, and aircraft specifications. The message indicated departure from Rabaul at 0600 Tokyo time on April 18th, with an arrival at Balal Airfield scheduled for 0800. Yamamoto's travel would be conducted in 2 Type 1 medium bombers, accompanied by an escort of 60 fighters. Technical Sergeant Harold Fudina, a Nisei linguist assigned to the Military Intelligence Service, verified his translation against the original ciphered text with painstaking care. The level of detail in Japanese military planning, precise timings, designated aircraft types, and specific flight paths offered an unprecedented opportunity. Commander William Goggins, overseeing FRUPAC operations, immediately recognized the significance of the intelligence. Within minutes, the decoded information reached Commander Edwin Layton, Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer. As he studied the details, it became clear Admiral Yamamoto, the strategist behind Pearl Harbor, would be vulnerable to interception for a narrow, predictable window. The implications were extraordinary. Yamamoto was not merely a fleet commander, he was a symbol of Japanese naval power. His elimination could undermine morale and strike a psychological blow across the Imperial Navy. Harvard-educated and widely traveled, Yamamoto understood American industrial strength more deeply than any of his peers. Though initially reluctant to confront the United States, he had meticulously orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor, achieved early tactical successes in the Pacific, and narrowly secured decisive outcomes at Midway before American codebreakers shifted the balance.